a warm-up for movement using DNS principles. So lie on a mat and place a half dome under the pelvis with the knees bent, and a blanket for the head if your head has a tendency to tilt back. And bring your legs and arms up. Then with your hands, check the intra-abdominal pressure. This should align the pelvis and the rib cage in a way that will allow you to create intra-abdominal pressure, and you should be able to perceive that with your hands wrapped around your waist, particularly into the sides of the waist and into the back. Then bring the arms up with the shoulder blades firm against the back, and introduce some movement, starting with an ipsilateral pattern, where the leg and the arm on the same side move in the same direction, and you're moving both sides at the same time in opposite directions. So as the left side lowers, the right side lifts, and as the left side lifts, the right side lowers. And try to adjust the degree of movement to your ability to stabilize the lower trunk with that movement. The half dome makes this much easier to do, so it's a good place to start on the half dome. So after you've done that for 6 or 7 repetitions, maybe a little bit more, then try a contralateral pattern where the leg and arm on opposite sides are moving in the same direction, and again both sides are moving at the same time. And repeat that for 6, 7 repetitions, maybe a little bit more if you like. Again, emphasizing stabilization over degree of movement, over range of motion. So we're interested in here, what's my range with stabilization more than what's my range period. Then come back to the starting position and come down to remove the half dome, and use the half dome now for the head. It helps to have the head a little bit higher, particularly if the neck is tight, which it often is. Again, check for the intra-abdominal pressure. Try to feel the muscles in the abdominal corset working. And then reintroduce the ipsilateral pattern for several repetitions. And notice right away how without the half dome, it's more challenging to stabilize with movement. And you may find that you'll do a smaller movement rather than emphasizing the degree of movement, emphasize the amount of movement you can do, the degree of movement you can do with stabilization. And then the contralateral pattern. Notice the synchronization between the leg and the arm. To transition to side lying, look in the direction you're going to turn. Bring that arm down and then orient your body to that arm on that side. Notice that the shoulder stays weighted and therefore my head doesn't sink down toward the floor. And when you're ready, turn the chest and the pelvis toward the floor to adduct the shoulder and the hip on that side, the right side in this case. And I'm using my left arm to help stabilize. And then as I'm turning away from that leg and arm, notice that the knee stays on the floor. So I'm abducting my right hip and my right shoulder, and then alternating the adduction again for a few breaths with the abduction. Again, the knee should stay down. So if my right knee comes up, I'm no longer abducting my right hip. So make sure that knee stays anchored. And as you're turning into adduction, try and turn the head around and look in the direction that you're turning That will help to keep the upper part of the spine upright and prevent you from going into hyperkyphosis. So try and do that 3 times in each direction, and then briefly come back to the side lying position, and then from there transition back to the supine position. Then turn to look left, bring the left arm down, and we'll repeat that sequence on the left side. Notice here how my right knee stays a little higher than my right hip, so I'm not letting that hip internally rotate. It may help when you're rotating toward the floor, as in this position, that you let the knee come down a little bit more. And when you're turning away from the left knee and arm, make sure that it's the pelvis leading the motion and not the right knee. So you can see how my right knee comes down toward my left knee, which is fine. It should do that because my pelvis is turning in that direction. It doesn't mean necessarily I'm internally rotating that hip. But once I'm back to the abducted position, the knee should be a little bit wider than the pelvis. So I'm going to repeat that 3 times on this side for a few breaths. Again, turning the head, I find really helps. And then back to the side lying position for a moment, and then transitioning to supine from there. It's the same setup to transition into a oblique sit. The elbow is down, and then I'm using my right lower leg and my hip to lift the pelvis up. Trying to keep the right shoulder blade wide and firm on the back so that I don't overload my shoulder or my hip doing the motion. So I'm holding for a few breaths, trying to come down with slowly and with control, and then transitioning back to side lying, and then from there back to the supine position. And then going on to the left side for an oblique sit on that side, and repeating the sequence on that side. So notice that the top leg, the right leg, in this case right foot, stays in dorsiflexion, but I plantar flex the left foot. That helps to increase my contact with the floor, which helps the hip work better. I can also, if I have the range of motion in my right shoulder, reach around and see if I'm able to remove any winging of that left scapula. So that gives me a clear sense of to what extent am I keeping that scapula wide and flat on the back. And then I need to remember to keep the head upright throughout that sequence. It's a tendency to go into kyphosis when I'm weight bearing on the shoulder that way. So I'm going to go to the oblique sit for a moment, and then come up onto the hand, and then transition into a prone position from there. First finding the distance for a kneeling plank, and then coming down into a prone position with the knees a little bit rolled out, and directing my breath into the low back. So you can really feel the intra-abdominal pressure inflating the lumbar spine here. And once you can feel that, then rotate the upper arms slightly out. Anchor the shoulder blades onto the outer upper ribs. And lift the head up, keeping the chin in and lengthening through the crown of the head. You can leverage a little bit with the wrists, Try not to weight bear too much in the elbows, as that has a tendency to push the shoulder blades together in the back. So after you've held it for 20-30 seconds, come down and rest and repeat that. I'm going to do it twice. I would recommend doing it maybe 3-4 times. And then from here I can transition back up onto my hands and knees into the kneeling plank. So it's kind of a good test for my ability to stabilize. Can my pelvis and my rib cage and my chest all come up at the same time? And then it's quite a bit more weight bearing here, so I'm really pushing down, really trying to keep the upper part of the spine lifted, still anchoring the shoulder blades, and then moving the hips back and taking the hips into a deep flex position while maintaining the alignment between my pelvis and my rib cage. So I'm training here to do movement from my hips and minimize the movement in my low back. So the more I can get the hips to move, the less that my spine has to do the moving, and the more ability I therefore have to stabilize the lower part of the spine when I'm doing movements in general. So I'm going to transition back and forth here a few times. And I would recommend using a mirror so that you can see what is actually happening, and if you're actually getting the hips to move, or are you just rounding your back when you move the hips back. Meanwhile, you're using the intra-abdominal pressure to keep the lower trunk stable. So I shorten the distance between my hands and my knees. So I'm in quadruped, and I've reactivated the stabilization, and I'm introducing another movement here, contralateral movement, where I'm lifting the leg and arm on the same side, just to test my ability to stabilize with less support. It's quite a bit more challenging. And then from here I can transition into a bear. So bear's like a downward dog position, but the knees stay bent. And that allows me to keep the pelvis and the rib cage aligned and to stabilize the pelvis and the lower trunk. And that will ultimately help me if I want to work on downward facing dog, as often in that posture the pelvis will have a tendency to tuck. And then from bear I can transition into a squat. Same stabilization. Notice I keep my eyes down so my neck stays elongated. That helps to keep the rib cage connected to the pelvis. And then from there I'm transitioning up into my upright standing position. Feet parallel, pelvis width, and letting my breath recover.